Assalamu alaikum. Kia ora, koutou katoa. Welcome everyone. I'm going to start with just a few introductory comments, some comments reflecting on the past 12 months, and then I'm happy to take questions. Just a note for domestic media, I know there'll be a range of other issues that you'll be interested in. We'll be providing a separate briefing relevant to domestic media and issues of the day after this one so that we can predominantly focus on March 15 for this one. I want to begin by first and foremost acknowledging the Muslim community here in New Zealand, not only for the impact that events since that day on March 15 have had on them, their friends, their family and their community, but also the ongoing generosity that the community has shown. That I think is exemplified by the fact that memorials as such are not traditional within Muslim communities, but from the time conversations began between council, the government and the community here in Christchurch, they were very clear that they acknowledged it was something that the New Zealand public may wish to mark, and were very open to the idea of a memorial in order to allow other New Zealanders to reflect with them. That for me is emblematic of the generosity we have seen from the community ever since that day. A year on gives us a chance as a nation to reflect on changes that have happened within our legislation, within our support services and within our country. I thought I would begin by just reflecting on some of the legislative changes that have occurred. Many of you will have been here in the period in which we moved immediately to ban semi-automatic weapons and military-style semi-automatic weapons and assault rifles in the aftermath of March 15. That was something that was supported by members of Parliament across the House and has meant that essentially those guns used in the attack were no longer able to be accessed in the way they were prior to that day. We have now removed 60,907 prohibited firearms from circulation. More than 194,245 prohibitive parts have been handed in, and approximately 102.2 million was paid in compensation as part of that buyback scheme. That, however, we always said was only the first part of the work we wanted to do to reform our gun legislation. Tranche 2 is currently having just emerged from Select Committee, having amendments made before it will enter back into the House. And I expect that will pass within the coming weeks and months and will be that next instalment for us tightening up our legislative regime for accessing guns in this country. New Zealanders, I think, have once again reaffirmed that access to firearms in New Zealand is a privilege and a responsibility, not a right. The Christchurch Call was also a fundamental part of our response to the events on the 15th of March. In the aftermath, I remember standing before you and many of you asked what it was we were going to do in our domestic legislation to try and prevent the kind of aftermath we saw of millions of uploads and copies of the horrific video of the attack on the mosques being broadcast globally. What became quickly apparent to me was that any domestic legislation would not necessarily prevent or stop what we experienced. And so began the work on the Christchurch Call. We now have 48 countries, 3 international organisations, 8 tech companies in support of that call. It has resulted in things like the Crisis Response Protocol, an initiative which I loosely describe as a civil defence response for attacks that are broadcast in this way online. Sadly, we have seen other events abroad which have called for the kind of coordination that we could have used on March 15th. As a result of the protocol and that coordination, in those events where social media platforms have been used to broadcast attacks, the circulation of those videos have been far, far diminished. My recollection is of a recent attack in Europe. The numbers were in the thousands as opposed to what we experienced here in New Zealand. Also, the body traditionally known as the GIFCT, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, has had their mandate expanded as a result of March 15, has had their membership now include full-time staff, and an executive director is currently being recruited. That body will continue the work of the Christchurch Call, including the preventative work and research around algorithms. One more example of the practical outcomes of the Christchurch Call work. Just yesterday, Twitter announced research that they are doing in conjunction with researchers at Otago University, how Twitter can be used as a platform to encourage discussion that encourages inclusivity rather than the counter, which we often see on social media. But it wasn't just about what we did in our legislation. We were mindful immediately in the aftermath that we needed to make sure we were supporting those directly affected by the attack. The work to make sure that we had individual case managers from the Ministry of Social Development, to ensuring that no one was excluded from support because of their status, to working hard to make sure that visa status, that the long-term stability of someone's status in New Zealand did not affect the support that they got, right through to ensuring that families who lost, for instance, those who held names on bank accounts, right through to the fact that many did not have anyone who could drive in their family. We looked at every single need and tried to address it. We've provided budget support, driver licensing support and training, English as a second language, as well as financial support and support with housing, and critically, of course, mental health. Christchurch in this region, very sadly, has experienced far more than ever any community should ever be expected to experience and endure. That's why we put additional funding to the tune of $17 million into the Canterbury DHB to help support some of their tailored initiatives specifically for the Muslim community. The phone line 1737, which is our general phone line for mental health and support, received roughly 13,000 calls in the 3 weeks after March 15, and that provided professional health and support for individuals throughout New Zealand who may have felt affected. Of course, there is also the work that we must do more broadly as a nation. We recognise that we had a job to do and a responsibility to support those who worship in New Zealand at synagogues or mosques to make their places safe to worship. We created a $6.8 million Safer Community Fund, which has been accessed by those faith communities who have had vulnerabilities at their places of worship to improve security there. We've held dozens of hui with Muslim women and youth to hear their concerns and their ideas for a safer New Zealand. Over 250 have attended some of those events across New Zealand. We, of course, launched the Royal Commission into the events of March 15, and we have learnings, I know, that will come of that Commission's work. We boosted the funding of the Office of Ethnic Communities to rebuild the office and ensure that it could provide practical support on the ground, including through some of the people I've met in recent days from the office who continue to support the community here. And finally, in April of 2019, we established the Christchurch Response Special Visa. It was a category for 3 groups that were significantly affected by the attacks: New Zealand-based families in which an immediate family member died, people living in New Zealand who were physically injured in the attacks and their New Zealand-based immediate families, and people living in New Zealand who were physically present at one of the mosques at the time and their immediate families. Of course, that has also meant making sure we give stability, importantly, for the widows who did not have permanent residency at the time of those attacks as well. A year on, I believe New Zealand and its people have fundamentally changed. I can't see how you could have an event like this and not. But the challenge for us will be ensuring that in our everyday actions, in every opportunity where we see bullying, harassment, racism, discrimination, calling it out as a nation, that is when we'll show that we each individually have a role to play in making sure New Zealand has fundamentally changed for the better. And that is what we must do every day. I'm happy to take your questions.
Prime Minister, can I ask you to reflect back on March 15th, a year ago? What was the moment that you knew the scale of this attack? You were in New Plymouth and you came to Wellington. what was the moment that it really triggered for you?
You're right. I was in a van travelling to visit a school in New Plymouth. I was in the van with the Mayor of New Plymouth and some others who were all part of the visit when I was handed the phone and started getting initially briefings from the Minister of Police. Now, at that point, we knew there was a shooter. We didn't know how many. We didn't know if it was a coordinated attack. And at that point, I recall being told that maybe 2 or 3 fatalities. Even at that point, I remember saying I need to get down to Wellington. In fact, I wanted to go directly. But at that point, I was not aware of the scale. The magnitude was probably when I managed to get to a space where I could switch on the news and I saw the images of the St John ambulances rolling in, and the scale of it and the numbers then were becoming clearer, and it was devastating. Yeah, I'll come in the front then down the back.
From the BBC Prime Minister, a couple of questions if you don't mind. You said that New Zealanders and New Zealand has changed.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you to elaborate on that? How did they change? Especially that if we practice the members of the Muslim community, and there is a concern about safety.
Yeah.
One practical question, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
With coronavirus worries globally,
Yeah.
and in New Zealand, of course, there's going to be a big gathering on Sunday scheduled. What are your worries
Yeah.
about having so many people
Yeah.
in one?
So I'll answer that in 2 parts. How have we changed? I think the awareness, the knowledge, the understanding that was built between New Zealanders and our New Zealand Muslim community has been really clear to me in the days that followed the weeks and the months. And that in large part is because the community opened their doors. I had New Zealanders telling me that they had visited a mosque for the first time or had conversations about faith with those they were visiting with. And that in itself was a way that I think many were changed by what happened on that day. Does it mean, however, that we have reached awareness across the country? Does it mean that we have removed discrimination from our community? Absolutely not. But I would like to think that there is growing and common resolve amongst New Zealanders that we wish to be defined by what we are not as much as by what we are. And that, I think, is more pronounced than ever as a result of March 15. On the issue of COVID-19, of course, as you will have seen from news today around other events going on across New Zealand, I take these issues very seriously. I take the advice of our health officials very, very seriously, and I've continually requested the most up-to-date advice. Their position has not changed on where New Zealand currently stands in terms of transmission. We do not have community transmission in New Zealand, and so that's the basis on which they've made their decisions around mass gatherings. The very clear advice I continue to give, though, is that if you feel unwell, do not attend the memorials on March 15. And for those who are attending, making sure that people, of course, acknowledge close contact protocols, which is very hard, I accept, in this environment, and basic public health, sneezing into your elbow, washing your hands. But I rely on that advice from public health officials, and because of New Zealand's current status, that is the advice they have given me.
Prime Minister, could that advice
Patty.
change in the next 24, 48 hours?
Oh, look, we obviously have been willing to take on board the advice that we're receiving and the information we have and make decisions as we need to. You will have seen that we've done that with Pacifica. In that case, there are very specific responsibilities we feel. The knowledge that we have about the number who are coming in from the Pacific to visit and then likely to exit again meant that we felt we needed that precautionary approach because of that specific event. But I am constantly checking in with our health officials, making sure we have the latest advice on the best way to proceed, and that is what we've done in this case.
So it could still be called off?
I can't see the basis on which the advice would change. But again, we've always been willing to move to support and protect New Zealand's public health. And so, I won't rule that out entirely, but I can't necessarily see that happening in the next 48 hours. But I will always base my decisions on the most up-to-date information and
who will
advice.
take responsibility? Because, as you pointed out yourself, the Muslim community is not really into anniversaries.
And look,
Who will take responsibility if that outbreak is caused by this mass gathering? Is that the government's responsibility?
again, every single case we've had, regardless, we have treated exactly the same in terms of contact tracing. You'll know we did have a case where someone was not aware of their illness when they attended an event. We've still managed to 100% contact trace close contacts for every case in New Zealand, and that will be the approach we continue to take. Yep. Yep.
Director Paul Money from the Australian newspaper. The Australian Director General of ASIO said recently that right-wing extremism was on the rise in Australia,
Yeah.
and that it had become more organised, more secretive, and much more ideological. I'm just wondering if New Zealand, or what without disclosing things that you shouldn't, what your own security services are telling you about the right-wing threat here in New Zealand, and whether or not you're observing similar trends.
Oh, and look, you'll understand why I make a general comment here. New Zealand is not free of those groups who define themselves as extremist white supremacists. Those groups exist here. And the responsibility we have to combat that, not only their existence, but the precursors to that existence, continue. My view would be that there's much more that we can do in those earlier stages. You know, what is it we do to make sure that if we see bullying and racism and discrimination in our schools, that we proactively and systematically seek to address that? Because at the moment, so much energy, of course, and agency response, absolutely going into acknowledging the aftermath, but there is much, much more, in my view, we could do to stop people being radicalised with those views in the first place. Yeah, I'll come just into the front row.
How would you describe the relationship with Australia in the aftermath of these attacks? Obviously, the accused gunman is from Australia. You've outlined all the things New Zealand did in the aftermath. Is Australia doing enough?
Well, you know, this event has not changed our relationship. This event here has not changed our relationship with Australia at all. In fact, you know, the response from leaders in Australia in supporting us through that period was extraordinary, and in every event since. And so for that, I want to be really, really clear. You'll notice that it's not something that is often commented on, the citizenship of the person in question, because for us it was actually about acknowledging what happened here on our soil and doing what we could to make sure it never happened again. As for other countries, I think probably all I can do is reflect on what I said the last time I had the chance to speak, not just on a domestic stage, but more broadly in New York in September. My view is actually our comments know no boundaries anymore, that leaders now have a stage that is amplified beyond the domestic, and that because of that we all have a responsibility, we all have a choice. We either promote ideas of inclusivity and are careful never to blame groups when we have challenges domestically, or we don't. But my call on leaders is to remember that your words travel, your sentiment travels. There are no borders anymore, and the impact of what you say can impact my nation as much as your own. Yeah, just here.
Barbara Miller, ABC Australia. The goal of the Christchurch Call was to eliminate terrorist content online. Do you think in retrospect that's perhaps too high a goal?
No, because I can't imagine signing up to anything that says, you know, eliminate just a little bit of terrorism and violent extremist content online. It is a large aspiration, but that has to be our aspiration. We live in a world now, of course, where this is our new form of publisher. These are our new broadcasters. And in my mind, all the Christchurch Call does is ask social media platforms to enforce what are their existing terms of service, but to do it in a much more effective, comprehensive way. And I don't think we should lose our ambition around what that will mean, and our expectations should not change. Yeah, second row. Oh, and then I'll come over to you.
Regarding the gun laws, there are estimates out there that says that there are still thousands of banned weapons that are still out there that haven't been handed in. Do you think that the people that actually handed in their guns are actually the potentially dangerous ones?
Yeah, I think we have to treat the environment as basically an ecosystem. You know, one of the issues, of course, has always been that there will be those who behave responsibly, lock up their weapons, ensure that they don't get into the wrong hands. But actually, even those who behave in that way have found that they have, through various reasons, had their guns' access taken stolen. So the more we're able to remove those from circulation, that has a knock-on effect. For those who still own those guns, there are now hefty penalties that will be applied. So there is no longer a buyback option. There is only a penalty for continuing to hold those firearms. And of course, we keep in mind that our police are doing an incredible job making sure that they are also confiscating those guns as part of their everyday actions as well.
But is New Zealand safer because there are still thousands of guns out there, banned weapons that are still out there?
Yes. Yes. If we reflect on the example of Australia, of course, no one looks back and says that they should never have made their moves, and I don't believe we'll ever look back and say that we shouldn't have made ours. You know, essentially the guns that were utilised in this attack, now we've made a move on, and 60,000 of them have been taken out of circulation. So fundamentally, yes. You know, I also reflect, I'm sure they won't mind me saying it, but I was talking to some of our first responders, many of whom I've met several times before, but one of them said something new to me today. They were amongst some of the group that came in first from the police to clear the building, to make sure that the shooter wasn't there anymore. And you can imagine they weren't sure how many there were. And his comment to me was, when he first walked in, even though he'd been told on comms that the shooter had left, he could not imagine that there was only one. Just the scale of what he saw in front of him, he could not imagine that one person was able to do that. And that was because of the weapon that that person had. And so I do believe New Zealand is safer. Oh, sorry, yes.
The survivors were told to say that the events of March 15 would never leave them.
Yes. Yeah.
A lot of other New Zealanders, and I guess a lot of other people around the world, are just dialing back into their emotions around this event. What is your advice to people that are clocking in, and the best way to honour the legacy of the people that died?
Yeah. And I think that's a very fair reflection. In my mind, remembering is not just memorials, and in fact that's something I think, if anything, the Muslim community would want us to think about, is not once a year reflecting on an event. It is, if we stand up and say that that is not who we are, it is demonstrating it every single day. And you know, I'm the Minister for Child Poverty Reduction, and so we formed a strategy on child wellbeing. We wanted New Zealand to be the best place in the world to be a child. Now, I expected when we did this work that we'd get a lot of feedback about kids on child poverty issues, on things in their local community that made a difference to them, maybe some comment on more time with mum and dad. What I did not expect, that one of the major themes that came through, was bullying and discrimination. Kids just want to be able to feel like they can be who they are without being teased or being excluded, and yet that exists in New Zealand. There are things that we can do every single day, the way we teach our kids, the way we act in our workplace, the way we respond to bullies and racism and discrimination. And that is what I think that we can best do to honour the legacy of those that were lost. I'll just come, if you don't mind, I'll scan around those.
What kind of concrete steps has your government undertaken against right-wing extremism?
Well, one of course, the things that you will have seen is in the release of our counter-terrorism strategy, there is a very public acknowledgement of the fact that these groups sit alongside groups that perhaps in the past have had more airtime in New Zealand and abroad, I would add. And so there's that end of the spectrum. And I have no doubt that we'll receive further commentary, advice from the Royal Commission. It's the reason we set it up. I expect that they will give us greater guidance on what more we need to do, not just at that end of the spectrum. But as I've already said, if we want to address issues that our children are experiencing, actually that's the place where we see the foundations of intolerance and hatred. And so we need to start there as well. And so I think too often we think about these being extreme events, when actually the seeds of them start somewhere else, and what can we do to address those? And in that regard, we have got a number of pieces of work that do work in our communities and with our children and in our education system. Yeah. Jackson.
You highlighted the initial political appetite for the first tranche of gun reform.
Yep.
That political appetite extended across the board. Are you disappointed that that political unity has disappeared? The National Party isn't supporting the second tranche of changes, and even your own coalition partner, New Zealand First, isn't on the same page?
Oh no, I reject the second half of that question. I think you'll see once we make the final announcements on the second tranche that what we've been working through are actually minor. If you let me just finish, I think you'll see once you see the final details of some of the minor amendments that are being made that we are, as a government, entirely on the same page. Just to finish, though, I am disappointed that more broadly we haven't had support from all of Parliament. My view is that actually putting in place some guidelines about what we expect from individuals who own guns in New Zealand, expecting them to be of certain character, a willingness to register weapons. This is all to make New Zealand safer. And I would have liked to have thought that everyone in Parliament could have got behind that.
So you can give us an assurance that New Zealand First isn't seeking to have these proposed changes watered down?
What are the proposed watered down? I can give you that assurance. You'll see for yourself when they're released. But we are going to have improved gun laws. And that will be the case once you see the details of those minor, what I consider to be small amendments.
Prime Minister, so you've obviously made great strides in your gun reform. Are you confident that those reforms are sufficient to prevent an attack? Presently sufficient and robust enough to prevent the sort we saw last year?
Yeah, well, two parts, I think I would say, in response to that. One is the types of weapons that you've been able to access in New Zealand. And of course, that was the element that we moved on very, very quickly. And so that essentially covers off the access point to the guns that were used in this attack. The second question then is around people's access to licences in New Zealand. And that's where we've focused our second tranche of reforms. In my mind, actually, those reforms have been a long time coming. The Thorpe report in New Zealand was decades old. We just haven't been able to build political consensus around the changes that New Zealand needed. And those changes for me, because they've time and time again been highlighted as the ones we need to make, I am confident that they will make a difference to the safety of New Zealanders. And they're much needed. My concern also is that without them, we might have seen further decline, and we needed to, of course, stop that. Everything that we do is in the hope that it never does. Everything. And I know that that would have been the focus for Australia when they've had horrific events like this. Everything we do, of course, is around trying to ensure this never happens again. And I would say not just in New Zealand. We've set our sights on trying to assure it doesn't happen elsewhere as well. I'll come down the back and then share. Yeah, Harold.
Just wondering if you can talk to me a little bit about the recent threats made towards the mosque. How concerned are you that these appear to be ongoing, and how concerned are you that some of the loopholes that existed within the security services that prevented this killer from being identified, how sure are you that those have been filled?
I'm not sure it would be fair to say, to label what has happened in that way as loopholes and so on. In fact, the best thing I think we can do is first and foremost allow the space for the court case to happen without prejudicing that. And then the Royal Commission report, I have every expectation, will canvass heavily because we set in their terms of reference. We wanted to know, was there anything that could or should have been done to have prevented this from happening in the first place? So I'm going to leave that there, those comments for that learning that we'll have from the Royal Commission. On the issue of threats to Al Noor, it feels unfathomable to me that after everything that the Muslim community have experienced, that we have people who have a desire and are acting on it to make threats against our Muslim community after everything that has happened. And that is something that, of course, we can't just stand up and condemn. We have to ensure the safety of the community. That's why we put in place, for instance, that Community Safety Fund. It was a very sad acknowledgement that we needed to provide practical support for greater security to be installed at synagogues and mosques to ensure the safety of worshippers. That is a very sad reality and something I wish New Zealand never had to do.
So
Yeah.
Just on that COVID-19, by cancelling Pacifica,
If you don't mind, I'll go into substantive COVID chat after the stand-up, okay? Unless it's relevant to the memorial.
well, it is related
Sure.
to it. I just, with cancelling Pacifica but not March 15th,
Yep.
doesn't that suggest that you're more concerned
No.
with the health of Pacific citizens than New Zealand citizens?
Absolutely not. Let me be very clear. We have currently no community transmission in New Zealand. So the Ministry of Health has continued to give me the same advice, that they don't advise a need for the cancellation of mass gatherings in New Zealand. However, I believe New Zealand has a responsibility as the gateway to the Pacific to do everything we can to prevent any transmission or any chance of transmission into the Pacific, because of course the impact on their health system and the ability of their health system to cope with cases, it would be hugely damaging. We've already seen what happened with measles. Now, I received advice very recently that there was a large number of people looking to attend Pacifica, coming in from the Pacific Islands and then returning to the Pacific Islands. That was a risk that there was no appetite for in Cabinet because of the responsibility we take so seriously to this Pacific, even though we currently have no community transmission here.
But doesn't it look, Prime Minister, inconsistent and risky to cancel Pacifica, but to have this
You will have, Paddy, if I could just again, Paddy, I'll just explain again. The Ministry of Health did not advise us that we needed to cancel Pacifica. Their advice has been absolutely the same. Their advice has been that there is no community transmission in New Zealand and therefore no currently public health grounds to cancel those events. But the advice I received was that we did have a large number of travellers from the Pacific coming in. Now, one of the issues we've got in our favour is our ability to contact trace every time we have a case in New Zealand. But that really is reliant on those people continuing to be in New Zealand, self-isolate in New Zealand and have access to New Zealand's health system. If we have individuals on a large scale, as we do from Pacifica, travelling back into the Pacific, I can't provide that self-isolation or that care. It was just a risk we weren't willing to take, even though the public health advice hadn't changed.
It's still 48 hours before the March 15.
And there's also a number of other events all around the country as well.
But
So
lots
in
of those
terms
are-
of those...
I'm going to keep the COVID questions to after this
but
stand-up.
But on the March 15...
I'll keep the COVID questions and I'm happy to answer them
but sorry,
again.
it's related to the March 15.
And I've answered this question. I'm happy to take them after the stand-up, which you'll be in attendance at, Jess. Yep.
So why was there not a special exemption made for people who were injured in the mosque attack to stay in social housing? When there's still a real sort of financial and a lot of people are
To stay in social housing?
Yes, to move into social housing.
No,
There was a man that spoke to you last week, Mohammed Sahada.
Yeah, so without getting into anyone's personal details, some of those access issues for social housing can depend on someone's status, which is why we tried very hard to make sure we gave security of status, particularly to those who had, like for instance, the widows, so that enabled them to access other services. There may well be cases of people whose visa status haven't allowed them access to public housing. Of course, that won't be widespread because we tried to deal with that as much as we could. In those cases, often our caseworkers are working to support them into private housing instead. In often cases, actually, people are in private housing regardless because of the availability. But those people have case managers who are there available and supporting to try and find the right housing fit.
But isn't this a unique situation? You could make an exemption just for this small group.
Well, that implies that actually social housing is A, the only option, or B, the best option. Sometimes it's not. Housing is what we want to support people into, and many of the individuals we've been working with will be and have been going into private housing because of the availability, the makeup of families, and for instance perhaps needing larger homes, or even making sure that we can quickly adjust, make sure our housing is fit for purpose for disability. So that's the key, getting the right house regardless.
Hey, have technology platforms been in touch with you since the Christchurch Call, and have you been satisfied with the progress they've made so far?
Yes, we've had frequent contact, and it's not just been through me, but through officials and so on. For instance, a number of events have taken place. We've had in Wellington at the end of last year. We had a protocol exercise where NGOs and social groups came together to look at the responses should we have an event like this again. And of course there's the work that the GIFCT is doing with officials.
Prime Minister, the March
You feel free to ask your
Yeah,
supplementary.
so, but one of the things that they were focusing on was counter-radicalisation online.
Yes.
Are you satisfied with
Oh, that
what's
work is
happening in that space?
no. That work is not done. There's a number of different streams where once we have the GIFCT and other working groups established, we'll continue that work. Algorithms is an area specifically where really we're at the early stages, but there is no timeline for this work and there is no endpoint. I expect it to continue, and I expect all nations to continue to apply pressure.
Prime Minister, could you just describe a little bit the personal, emotional impact on yourself of March?
No. I felt as uncomfortable then as I do now talking about myself in this regard, because it's never been about me.
Prime
Yeah.
Minister, just,
A last one.
Thank you. On a follow-up to what you said about the safety of the Muslim community, the
Yeah.
safety of the places
Yes.
of worship. What do you say to members of the Muslim community, to families
Yes.
who a year on feel unsafe after what happened? And also, just on the location of the March 15th memorial, it has been moved, we understand, because of
Rain.
weather conditions,
Yeah.
of rain. Were there also security concerns?
That's not my understanding. I believe it was simply an issue of the weather, but ultimately that was made locally. In terms of those who feel unsafe to worship, there are things we can do to buildings, there are things we can do to security gates and access points, but for me, people will feel safe when they feel supported, when they feel that their community is looking after them, when they feel they're not facing discrimination or jibes in the street or comments that make them feel unsafe. And so we can help support the physical, but we need everyone to help support the community with that sense of security that they feel day to day. And
Far-right groups are a threat.
they're a global threat. It's not just New Zealand. All right, thank you everyone.